everybody, and welcome to the Morning Coffee Bible Podcast. Today we are walking through the Gospel of Mark, chapter 1. I'm excited to start this series, so let's dive in. Today we're in Mark chapter 1, and again, as I said in my introduction thing, I want to give some highlights, a run through of the text, but I think the best way to start with Mark is to look at chapter 1, and it says very clearly, verse 1, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written by the prophet Isaiah, "See, I am sending my messenger ahead of you, and he will prepare your way, a voice of one crying out in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, and make his paths straight." And I want to stop right there. And so I want you to see that from the very beginning, in the very first verse, and this is important, that it's in the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. So Mark is very clear. This is the good news about Jesus Christ. And oh, by the way, the Son of God. So as we look at Mark, we're going to kind of look, what does it say about Jesus, who Jesus is? And one of the things I want you to know is from the very first verse, from the intro of Mark, he is clear. This is Jesus Christ, the Son of God. There is something special about who Jesus is. And I want you to see that as we dive in together. So we want to look first at some highlights. This is kind of our run through of the text and our highlights of the text. And we want to see that Jesus taught with never heard before authority. Where do I get that from? I get that as he begins to teach in the synagogue, and you're going to, for that, look at verses 21 through 28, specifically verse 22, and he says, and Mark says, "And they were astonished at his teaching, because he was teaching them as one who had authority, and not like the scribes." And what you have to realize is the scribes were the teachers. They were the teachers of the law, and yet Jesus spoke, so they had authority, and Jesus taught in a way that blew everyone out of the water. He taught with an authority no one had ever heard of before, no one had ever seen before. And this is in Capernaum, so this is kind of like his base of operations. And they say this is verse 21, they went to Capernaum, and right away he entered the synagogue on the Sabbath, and he began to teach. And I wanted to point out that earlier in the chapter, it's clear that Jesus came to teach. He came to proclaim the kingdom of God has arrived in him. And he shows up and he begins to teach, and they were astonished at his teaching, again, because he had authority that no one had ever seen before. He had compassion that no one had ever seen before. Well, where do I see that? Well, it's quite amazing that as he's teaching in Capernaum, that some things are going to begin to happen there. So we look at verse 41. And in verse 41, there's this story. Now he's actually moved on to Galilee. And again, he's preaching in all the synagogues in Galilee, and he's driving out demons. He drove out a demon earlier. We're going to look back at that as we kind of look through different sections here. But in verse 41, this leper comes up, someone who is unclean. He's a stay away from that guy kind of person. And he approaches Jesus. And he says, "If you are willing, can you make me clean?" Moved with compassion. I don't think Mark left out that detail, or he did not add in that detail on accident. He's very intentional in saying Jesus was moved with compassion, and he reached out his hand and did something no one had ever done. He taught with authority no one had ever heard, and he reached out and touched with compassion that no one had ever seen. And he reaches out and he touches this leper and he says, "I am willing." And he told him, "Be made clean." And immediately the leprosy left him and he was made clean. And then he does something really interesting. This is an observation that you should see, and we're going to look at this a little later in themes. But he actually sternly warned him and sent him away, not and telling him, "See that you don't tell anybody." And that's going to kind of become a theme we'll see, and we'll talk about that a little more later. But he reached out with compassion that no one had ever seen before. And Jesus came to preach good news more than to change our temporary state. Well, that's an interesting phrase. What am I talking about? Well, let's look at verse 38 for that. And this is what he says. And he said to them, so he's been preaching in Galilee. So let me read 35. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, he got up and he went out and he made his way to the deserted place. And there he was praying. We'll come back to that. Simon and his companions searched for him, and when they found him, they said, "Everyone's looking for you. You've done all these miracles. People were out just like almost crowding him constantly. Heal this person, heal that person." And yet Jesus gets away and he prays. And when they find him and go, "Hey, everybody's looking for you," Jesus does not say, "Well, let's go back and let me heal him." He says, "Let's go to another village so that I may preach there too. And this is why I came." And that's one of the highlights of this, that Jesus came to preach the good news. More than just change the temporary state. He had compassion. He cared. He healed while he was here. But he also came to preach the good news. And that's good news for us. So as we move on from the highlights, we want to get into what are some questions this chapter may bring out for us. Well, one of the questions that it brings out for me is, why did Jesus tell the man with leprosy, and he told the man who was with the demon not to tell anybody? And that is a theme. I'm not going to answer that right now because that is the theme. But what I want you to do, look for that, because that is throughout this entire book. That is a theme that will build and build and build and build until the very end. And so I don't want to answer that yet. I want to see that played out. I want you to see that played out. I might look at what did Jesus mean by "I will make you fishers of men"? That just seems to be an odd call, and there are answers for that, and that again is seen through the book as well as beyond the book of Mark, that he gave them more. It's more than just, "You're following me as students. I'm going to make you fishers. You're fishers of fish. I'm going to make you fishers of men, fishers of people." So I want you to see that question. Think about that as you read the text. And the last question here is, I want you to, well, this is not a question, but I want you to think of your own questions too. I want you to be, as you read this, writing down things. Maybe you don't understand something. Maybe you just find the way Mark said something very interesting. Write that question down and think about it later. Meditate on that. So these are just some questions that I want you to start to begin to form as you read through the book of Mark specifically, and the Bible as a whole. Ask questions. Well, what are some ways that we can respond to Mark chapter 1? Well, we see that Jesus thought preaching the good news was important. And it leads us to kind of ask the question of ourselves, am I doing the same? You see, if Jesus thought it very important to preach the good news, to preach the gospel, to preach that, and for us to preach that Jesus came, he lived and he died and he rose again, and through a relationship with him, we can have an eternal fellowship with the God who made us. That's good news. There's an answer for the heartache of this world, and it's Jesus. That's good news. And Jesus modeled what it meant to show up, to be busy in ministry. He had people crowding him constantly, and he said, "We must go to another village. I came to teach." Now, he healed where he could, but he came to teach. He knew his mission. So the question is, am I doing the same thing? Or am I allowing the busyness of life, the busyness of ministry to crowd in so much so that I'm no longer ministering the word? I'm no longer sharing the good news with my friends because I'm just too busy with work. I'm just too busy with school. I'm just too busy with church. And I would argue that if you find yourself going, "I'm just too busy for," stop there. Jesus was a busy man. He was so busy that, in fact, and tired, he healed late into the night, and yet he got up early, fatigued, busy, pressed, and he prayed. And he went and he continued to preach the good news because he knew, this is why I came. Another response, I must continue to leave the world behind and follow Jesus. Well, why would we respond like that? I think part of the reason is because Jesus came and he called us to leave the world behind. I'm getting this from as he called his disciples. So look at verse 16. As he passed along the Sea of Galilee, he saw Simon and Andrew and Simon's brother casting nets into the sea. And he said, "Follow me." And Jesus told them, "And I will make you fishers for people," or fishers of men. Immediately they left their nets and they followed him. Going a little further, he saw James and John, the son of Zebedee, in a boat putting their nets. And he immediately called them. And they left their father Zebedee on the boat with the hired men, and they followed him, which is kind of funny. Why? Am I leaving everything? I mean, these guys left their livelihood. They left their jobs to follow Jesus around and to become a student of the Master. Are we leaving behind the things in our lives? If God called us to move across the world today, could we drop everything and go? If God called me to leave a good job and to go to another part of America or to another job that pays less because that's what he called me to do, am I willing to do that? To leave the world behind, to follow my King? Something you need to think about. In what ways is Jesus calling you now to follow him? Are you following him in those ways? And the last response, I need to spend time in prayer. As busy as Jesus was, I mean, just read what leads up to that passage. He goes to Peter's mother-in-law and he heals her. She's sick, and then these people find out. And then when evening came, after the sun had set, they brought to Jesus all those who were sick and demon-possessed, and the whole town was assembled at the door. And he healed many who were sick with various diseases, and he drove out many demons. And he would not permit demons to speak because they knew him. Another part of that theme of being quiet. And then it's very early in the next morning. While it's still dark, he gets up and he prays. And I know I struggle with praying, struggle with getting up early. And getting up early to pray is very difficult. My mind doesn't cut on. But Jesus thought it important enough to get up early after a busy day with a busy day ahead to pray. Am I spending adequate time in prayer? And what do I need to arrange in my schedule to make sure I have that time? Because prayer must be the priority for us. Well, so what are some things we learn about Jesus? And these are going to be rapid fire. He is the good news. We learned that from the very beginning. He is God. Mark's clear about that. He was tempted, but he overcame the wilderness thing. It's very short in Mark, by the way. It's just a couple of verses. Let me look at that, verse 12. It says, immediately after the baptism, the Spirit drove him into the wilderness, and he was in the wilderness for 40 days, being tempted by Satan. And he was with the wild animals, and the angels were serving him, and he overcomes that temptation. That's important. He overcame when tempted. Jesus taught a lot. Throughout the entire book of Mark, he teaches a lot. Jesus healed. He heals people throughout the entire book of Mark. Jesus has compassion on people throughout the book of Mark, but especially in chapter 1 here. Jesus took time away from the busyness of life to pray. He thought prayer was a priority. You should too. And Jesus had a mission. We also have a mission to follow our King and to follow the model he set forth. He had a mission. He put his mind to it. And he went about his mission, and he's called us to join him on that mission. We learned Jesus was focused in his mission. Let's look at some themes as we wrap up here. Themes that are explored throughout the book of Mark. We see that Jesus is telling people to be silent and them not listening, which means Jesus tells the man with leprosy to be silent. Don't tell anybody that I healed you. And he goes and he does the exact opposite. He tells people that he was healed by Jesus. Meanwhile, he'll throw demons out and permit them not to speak, and they obey him. So it's interesting. You have demons obeying Jesus and people who are healed not obeying him. And that's a theme we see throughout the entire book of Mark, and especially in chapter 1. We see authority. Authority is going to be another one of those themes that we can trace throughout the whole book. He taught with authority. He cast out demons with authority. And it's kind of cool because in verse 27 it says they were all amazed, and so they began to ask each other, what is this, a new teaching with authority? He commands even the unclean spirits and they obey him. There's a theme there too. And at once the news about him spread throughout the entire vicinity of Galilee. So the theme of authority is going to play throughout the book of Mark. Jesus teaches and he heals and he commands, and everything he does is with an authority that is unlike anything that's ever been seen before. And you're also going to have this theme of immediacy. Mark loves the word immediate. He says it constantly, immediately, immediately, immediately. They immediately drop their nets. They immediately go. Immediately they were. And he continues. You can see this word repeated throughout the whole book, but there's a sense of immediacy with Mark. The book of Mark moves. It is a fast-moving book. And that's one of the themes we see. So there's just three themes. We're going to see those played out as the book continues, but I want to point those out to you today, and I commend you to think about those things, to meditate on those themes, to meditate on the responses, and to meditate on the questions. Well, until next time, this has been the Morning Coffee Bible Podcast.